The sound of shears hitting the floor echoed through the small barber shop in Manassas, Colorado, as Lorelai Elkins clutched her trembling fingers to her mouth. She couldn't bear to watch as the barber prepared to cut away her waist-length auburn hair, the same hair her mother had brushed every night before she passed. The same hair her father said reminded him of autumn leaves dancing in the wind. But some things were worth more than beauty, and her father's life was one of them. It was 1883, and the harsh winter had brought with it an illness that gripped Thomas Elkins' lungs like an iron vise. The local doctor had prescribed a costly medicine from Denver, one that would drain what little savings Lorelai had scraped together from teaching at the schoolhouse. The drought had devastated their small farm outside town, and with her father too weak to work, Lorelai had exhausted every option. "Miss Elkins, are you certain about this?" Mr. Peterson, the barber, asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Your hair must be near 20 inches. Mrs. Harrington at the millinery would pay handsomely for it, but still." "I'm certain," Lorelai replied, her voice steadier than she felt. At 23, she had weathered enough hardships to know when pride needed to yield to necessity. "Father needs that medicine by week's end, or Dr. Winters says his pneumonia will worsen." The barbershop door swung open, bringing with it a gust of autumn air and the imposing figure of a man Lorelai had seen around town but never formally met. Everyone in Manassas knew Quentin Xavier, by reputation a cattle rancher who'd built his spread from nothing after returning from the war. His broad shoulders filled the doorframe as he removed his hat, revealing dark hair with threads of silver at the temples, despite him being only in his early 30s. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, took in the scene before him, the shears in Peterson's hand, the young woman with tears threatening to spill, and the long braid she clutched protectively. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying the slight drawl of a man who'd spent time in Texas. "But I couldn't help overhearing your predicament, Miss Elkins." Lorelai straightened her spine, embarrassment flushing her cheeks. The last thing she wanted was an audience to her desperation, especially from a man whose success made her own failures feel all the more acute. "Mr. Xavier," she acknowledged with a polite nod, "this is a private matter." "Private matters have a way of becoming town affairs in Manassas," he replied, stepping fully into the shop. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. "I understand your father is ill. How much do you need for the medicine?" Lorelai blinked, momentarily stunned. $20, but I couldn't possibly take my money instead of your beauty, Miss Elkins," he said, counting out the bills and placing them on the barber's counter. "Consider it an advance." "An advance," she echoed, suspicion replacing surprise. She'd heard stories of men who preyed on women in desperate situations, offering help with hidden costs. "For what exactly, Mr. Xavier?" A hint of a smile touched his mouth. "My ranch hands are abysmal at their letters and figures. With winter coming, I'd rather they weren't signing purchase orders they can't read or calculating feed they can't count. I understand you're the schoolteacher. I'm proposing to hire you to teach them 3 evenings a week." Lorelai hesitated, her hand still protectively covering her braid. "That's generous, but it's business," he corrected firmly. "Nothing more. A man with illiterate hands is at a disadvantage, and I don't care for disadvantages, Miss Elkins." He replaced his hat. "The offer stands. Take the money, get your father's medicine, and come by the Xavier Ranch once he's on the mend, or sell your hair and decline my offer. The choice is yours." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. Lorelai found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Why would you help a stranger?" Quentin paused at the door, his expression unreadable. "I'm not in the habit of explaining myself, Miss Elkins, but let's just say I know what it's like to watch someone you love suffer while counting pennies that won't stretch far enough." Something flashed across his face, a memory, perhaps before he nodded. "Good day." The door closed behind him, leaving Lorelai staring at the $20 on the counter, pride warred with practical need in her chest. "Well, Mr. Peterson said, breaking the silence. "Seems you have a decision to make, Miss Elkins." Lorelai looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the hair her mother had loved so dearly, then thought of her father's rasping cough that kept them both awake at night. She reached for the money with a steady hand. "It seems I do," she murmured. The ride home was filled with conflicting emotions. Relief that she could purchase her father's medicine without selling her hair ward with uncertainty about accepting help from a virtual stranger, especially one as intimidating as Quentin Xavier. The autumn sun was beginning to set as Lorelai guided her mare along the dusty road leading to their modest farmhouse. Their land had once been promising 15 acres with good soil and access to Crystal Creek. But 3 years of poor rainfall had turned the fertile soil to dust, and her father's stubborn pride had prevented him from seeking aid until illness had finally laid him low. Now the fields lay fallow, and their small herd of 6 cows provided just enough milk to trade for essentials in town. As she dismounted and tied her horse to the hitching post, Lorelai noticed smoke rising from the chimney. Alarm seized her father shouldn't be out of bed tending the fire. She rushed inside to find a surprising scene. Widow Abernathy, their nearest neighbor at a quarter-mile down the road, was stirring a pot of stew over the fire while her father rested in his chair, a quilt drawn over his legs. "Lorelai," Thomas Elkins greeted with a weak smile that dissolved into a racking cough. At 52, illness had aged him beyond his years, hollowing his cheeks and dimming the vibrant green eyes she'd inherited. "You should be in bed, father," she chided gently, crossing the room to feel his forehead. His skin burned beneath her palm. "Nonsense. A man can't spend all day staring at ceiling boards," he protested feebly. Mrs. Abernathy was kind enough to bring supper. The older woman turned from the hearth with a kind smile. "Just being neighborly. How did your errand in town go, dear?" Lorelai's hand went to her pocket where the money lay safely tucked away. "Well enough. I'll ride to Denver on tomorrow's stage to get father's medicine." Her father's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Denver?" "But Lorelai, we haven't the money for it's taken care of," she interrupted, unwilling to explain the circumstances with Mrs. Abernathy present. The widow was kind-hearted but notorious for spreading news faster than telegraph wires. After a simple supper, during which Lorelai managed only a few bites despite her hunger, Mrs. Abernathy took her leave with promises to look in on Thomas while Lorelai made the journey to Denver. Once they were alone, her father fixed her with the penetrating gaze that had always seen through her childhood fibs. "Now then, daughter, tell me how you've managed to secure funds for medicine that costs more than we've seen in months." Lorelai sat beside him, taking his rough, work-worn hand in hers. "I had intended to sell my hair at the barber shop," she admitted. "But Mr. Xavier happened by and offered me employment, teaching his ranch hands reading and arithmetic 3 evenings a week." Quentin Xavier. Her father's expression darkened slightly. "The cattleman from the North Valley." "Yes, do you know him?" Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Known of him since he came to these parts 6 years ago. Built that big spread from nothing, they say, keeps to himself mostly." He seemed direct. "But honorable," Lorelai offered, uncertain why she felt compelled to defend a man she barely knew. "Most say he is." Her father studied her face. "But I don't like the idea of you being beholden to any man, Lorelai, especially not one with his reputation." "What reputation?" she asked, curiosity piqued. "They say he fought for the Union, came back changed like many did. Doesn't suffer fools or liars, fair in business but hard." Thomas squeezed her hand. "And unmarried, which makes me wonder at his interest in helping a pretty young woman." Heat rose to Lorelai's cheeks. "Father, it's nothing of that sort. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." "So was every courting that started with a man doing a favor for a woman in need," Thomas muttered. Another coughing fit seized him and Lorelai rushed to fetch him water. As she watched him struggle for breath, she knew she had no choice. The medicine couldn't wait, regardless of Quentin Xavier's motives. I'm going to Denver tomorrow, she said firmly once his coughing subsided, and I'll fulfill my obligation to teach his men. But I promise you, Father, it's strictly professional. Thomas nodded weakly, too exhausted to argue further. As Lorelai helped him to bed, she wondered about the enigmatic rancher who had saved her from losing her hair and potentially saved her father's life. What kind of man performed such a kindness for a stranger? And why did the thought of seeing him again send a flutter of something undefined through her chest? The journey to Denver was long and uncomfortable, but Lorelai hardly noticed the jostling stage or the dust that coated her traveling dress. Her mind alternated between worry for her father, left in Mrs. Abernathy's care, and curiosity about Quentin Xavier. By the time she reached the bustling city, purchased the precious medicine from an apothecary on Larimer Street, and boarded the return stage, she had resolved to approach their arrangement with professional detachment. 3 days after her return to Manassas, with her father showing the first signs of improvement thanks to the medicine, Lorelai found herself approaching the Xavier Ranch on her mare. The property was impressive, a sprawling main house built of sturdy logs with a wide porch, flanked by a large barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Fields stretched toward the mountains, dotted with cattle that represented wealth beyond what most in Manassas could imagine. As she tied her horse to the hitching post, the front door opened, and Quentin Xavier emerged. Without his hat, she noticed how the late afternoon sunlight caught the streaks of silver in his dark hair. He wore no jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of ranch work. "Miss Elkins," he greeted, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "You've come about the teaching position." "Yes, Mr. Xavier." She straightened her shoulders, determined to present herself as a professional educator rather than a woman who had accepted charity. "I'm ready to begin whenever your men are available," he nodded, studying her for a moment. "Your father's health is improving, I trust." The genuine concern in his voice caught her off guard. "Yes, thank you, the medicine is working well." "Good," he gestured toward the house. "Come inside, we should discuss particulars before you meet the men." Lorelai followed him into a house far more refined than she'd expected for a bachelor rancher. The main room boasted a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and bookshelves filled with volumes that suggested their owner was far more educated than the average cattleman. "You have quite the library," she observed, unable to hide her surprise as she scanned titles ranging from Shakespeare to treatises on modern agriculture. A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed his features. "Did you expect a cowhand who could only sign his name with an X?" "I didn't know what to expect," she admitted candidly. "You're something of a mystery in town, Mr. Xavier." "I prefer it that way," he gestured to a chair. "Please sit. Coffee, thank you." He poured 2 cups from a pot keeping warm on the stove, adding, "I've arranged for you to use the bunkhouse dining area for your lessons. 5 of my men expressed interest in improving their reading and writing, 2 in basic mathematics as well." Lorelai accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "What are their current abilities?" "Varied. Rodriguez can read simple words but struggles with writing. The McCready brothers are functionally illiterate. Johnston can keep basic accounts but makes frequent errors. Williams can read quite well but his writing is nearly indecipherable." She was impressed by his detailed knowledge of his employees' capabilities. "You seem well informed about your men's skills." Quentin sat across from her, his posture relaxed but still emanating a natural authority. A good employer knows the strengths and weaknesses of those who work for him. He took a sip of coffee. "I propose Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings from 6 until 8, $2 per lesson payable weekly." Lorelai nearly choked on her coffee. $2 per lesson, that's exceedingly generous. It's fair compensation for your time and skill," he countered. "Education is valuable, Miss Elkins. I've seen too many good men cheated because they couldn't read a contract or calculate their due." There was something in his tone, a hint of personal experience that made her wonder about his past. "When would you like me to begin?" She asked, setting aside her curiosity. "Tomorrow evening, if that suits you." He rose and crossed to a desk in the corner, returning with a slate and a box of chalk. "These are for your use. I've ordered proper primers and copybooks from Denver, but they won't arrive for another week." Lorelai accepted the teaching materials, their fingers brushing briefly. She ignored the inexplicable warmth that traveled up her arm at the contact. "One more thing, Miss Elkins," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The men respect you as the town's teacher, but they're rough around the edges. If any of them speak or behave inappropriately, I expect you to inform me immediately." "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Xavier, but I've taught the Donovan boys. If I can handle those two ruffians, I suspect I can manage your cowboys." She offered a small smile, surprising herself with her ease in his presence. For the first time, a genuine smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "I've heard stories about the Donovan boys. Very well, Miss Elkins. I'll trust your judgment." As he walked her to the door, Lorelai found herself wondering about the contradiction of this man, hard and soft, formal yet fair, solitary but surrounded by men who clearly respected him enough to seek education at his suggestion. "Until tomorrow, then," she said, gathering her reins. Quentin helped her mount with strong, steady hands at her waist. "Until tomorrow. Safe journey home, Miss Elkins." As she rode away, she felt his eyes following her and resisted the urge to look back. Whatever this arrangement was, business, charity, or something she couldn't yet define, Lorelai knew her life had just become considerably more complicated. The next evening, Lorelai arrived at the Xavier Ranch precisely at 5:45, a quarter hour before her first lesson was to begin. She had spent much of the previous night planning how to approach teaching grown men with varying levels of literacy, drawing on her 3 years of experience with Manassas's diverse student population. As she approached the bunkhouse, she heard male voices and laughter, which abruptly quieted when she knocked on the door. A moment later, it swung open to reveal a tall man with a shock of red hair and a freckled face. "Miss Elkins," he greeted, doffing his hat. "I'm Sean McCready. The boss said you'd be coming." He stepped back, revealing a clean but simple dining area where 4 other men were seated at a long table, looking as uncomfortable as schoolboys on the first day of term. "Good evening, gentlemen," Lorelai said with the confident tone she used with her most rambunctious students. "I'm Miss Elkins, and I understand you're interested in improving your reading and arithmetic skills." A murmur of assent went through the men. Lorelai took a moment to survey her new pupils. Besides Sean McCready, there was a younger man with similar features who must be his brother, an older Mexican man with salt and pepper hair, a wiry fellow with spectacles perched on his nose, and a broad-shouldered black man who met her gaze steadily. "Perhaps we could begin with introductions," she suggested, setting her teaching materials on the table. The men introduced themselves: Liam McCready, Sean's younger brother; Miguel Rodriguez, Franklin Johnston, the man with spectacles; and Isaiah Williams, who had been born a slave in Georgia before the war. "Mr. Xavier tells me you each have different goals," Lorelai continued. "So I'd like to start by assessing where each of you stands, and then we can work both as a group and individually." For the next 2 hours, Lorelai divided her attention among the men, discovering that Mr. Xavier's assessment had been accurate. The McCready brothers could barely recognize their names in writing, while Isaiah could read at a reasonable level, but his handwriting was indeed nearly impossible to decipher. Miguel knew his letters but struggled with English pronunciation, and Franklin needed help primarily with more complex mathematics. To her pleasant surprise, all 5 men were earnest and respectful, tackling their lessons with determination that reminded her why she had become a teacher in the first place. By the end of the session, she had developed a plan for each man and assigned simple exercises for them to practice before their next meeting. "That was a right fine lesson, Miss Elkins," Sean McCready said as she gathered her materials. Didn't think learning could be so. He searched for the word. Interesting, she supplied with a smile. Exactly so, madam. As the men thanked her and filed out, Lorelai noticed Quentin Xavier leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. How long he had been observing, she couldn't say, but there was approval in his expression. You have a gift for teaching, he commented as the last of the men disappeared toward their quarters. They responded well to you. They're eager to learn, she replied, pleased by his observation. That makes teaching a joy rather than a chore. He stepped into the room, taking the slate from her hands to carry it alongside her chalk and papers. Allow me to walk you to your horse. The evenings are growing colder. Outside, the sunset painted the mountains in hues of purple and gold, a spectacular backdrop to the ranch buildings. A crisp breeze tugged at Lorelai's shawl, and she pulled it tighter around her shoulders. Your father continues to improve. Quentin asked as they walked toward the hitching post where her mare waited patiently. Yes, thank you. He's still weak, but the cough is less severe and his fever has broken. She glanced sidelong at the rancher. He's curious about you, you know, as is most of Manasseh, I suspect. A wry smile touched his lips. And are you curious as well, Miss Elkins? The directness of his question brought heat to her cheeks. It would be natural, wouldn't it? You appeared exactly when I needed help, offered employment that benefits both your men and my family, and yet we know very little about you beyond rumors. They reached her horse, and he handed her teaching materials back. What sort of rumors? Lorelai hesitated, unsure if she should repeat town gossip to his face. That you fought in the war, that you came west with nothing and built all this through hard work and determination, that you're fair but demanding. All true, he acknowledged, reaching to adjust her horse's bridle with practiced hands. What else? She bit her lip. That you keep to yourself because of some tragedy in your past. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes confirmed the speculation. People always need a story to explain behavior they don't understand. Sometimes solitude is simply a preference, Miss Elkins. And sometimes it's armor, she responded softly, the words escaping before she could consider their impropriety. Quentin's gaze snapped to hers, surprise evident in the slight widening of his eyes. For a moment, she thought she'd offended him, but then he gave a short laugh that seemed rusty from disuse. You're more perceptive than most, Miss Elkins. He helped her mount, his hands firm but gentle at her waist. Once she was settled, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. Your payment for today's lesson. Lorelai accepted it with a nod. Thank you, Mr. Xavier. I'll return on Friday as agreed. Quentin, he said unexpectedly, if we're to be working together, you might as well use my given name. The invitation to informality surprised her. Then you must call me Lorelai, at least when we're not in front of your men. He stepped back, his face half shadowed in the fading light. Safe journey home, Lorelai. As she rode away, the sound of her name in his deep voice seemed to follow her through the gathering twilight. Over the next 3 weeks, a routine developed. 3 times a week, Lorelai would ride to the Xavier Ranch after completing her duties at the schoolhouse. For 2 hours, she would teach the 5 ranch hands whose progress exceeded her expectations. Afterward, Quentin would walk her to her horse, and they would talk briefly before she rode home. These conversations, though short, gradually revealed pieces of the man behind the reserved exterior. She learned he had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a shopkeeper. That he had indeed fought for the Union, rising to the rank of captain despite his youth. That he had come west after the war seeking a fresh start, working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas before saving enough to purchase land in Colorado. In turn, she shared stories of growing up as the daughter of a farmer who had moved west seeking better opportunities after her mother's death when Lorelai was 12. She told him of her love for teaching, her dream of someday starting a proper library in Manasseh, and her worry that her father would never fully recover his strength. What began as professional courtesy slowly evolved into something that, if not quite friendship, was certainly more than a business relationship. Lorelai found herself looking forward to their brief exchanges, storing up observations and questions throughout her day that she thought might interest him. Thomas Elkins noted the change in his daughter with a father's perceptiveness. One evening after supper, as Lorelai sat mending a tear in one of her shirtwaists, he broached the subject that had clearly been on his mind. "You seem in good spirits these days," he observed, his breathing still labored but much improved. Despite working double duty between the schoolhouse and Xavier's ranch, Lorelai looked up from her stitching. "The extra income has been a blessing, Father, and teaching eager students is hardly a hardship." Thomas studied her with knowing eyes. "And I suppose the fact that Quentin Xavier himself escorts you to your horse each evening has nothing to do with your cheerful disposition." The needle pricked her finger and Lorelai sucked in a breath. "He's simply being courteous." "Is he now?" Her father leaned forward in his chair. "Lorelai, I've been meaning to speak with you about this arrangement. It's been nearly a month. You've more than repaid whatever debt you felt you owed him for that medicine money." "It's not about repaying a debt anymore," she protested. "His men are making real progress." Miguel wrote his first letter to his family in Mexico last week. The McCready brothers can now read simple stories. "Why would I abandon them now?" Thomas sighed. "Because people are starting to talk, daughter, Mrs. Abernathy mentioned yesterday that Widow Prescott saw you and Xavier in what she called close conversation by the mercantile last Saturday." Lorelai felt heat rise to her face. It had been an innocent encounter. She had been selecting fabric for new curtains when Quentin entered the store to order supplies. They had exchanged pleasantries, and he had offered his opinion on which fabric might best withstand the strong afternoon sun in their front windows. Nothing improper had occurred, yet the memory of his closeness as he'd examined the different cloths beside her sent a traitorous warmth through her chest. "We merely spoke about curtain fabric," she said defensively. "There was nothing improper in our conversation." "I don't doubt that," Thomas assured her. "But you're a young, unmarried woman spending regular time at the home of a bachelor. In a town this size, that's enough to set tongues wagging." Lorelai set her mending aside, frustration evident in the set of her shoulders. "So I should abandon my students because of idle gossip? What of my reputation as a teacher who sees things through?" Her father reached across to pat her hand. "I'm not suggesting you stop teaching altogether. Perhaps you could move the lessons to town, the schoolhouse maybe." The suggestion was reasonable, and yet Lorelai felt an inexplicable reluctance. "I'll consider it," she conceded, knowing her father meant well. "That's all I ask." Thomas squeezed her fingers. "You're all I have, Lorelai. I just want to protect you even from yourself if necessary." That night, Lorelai lay awake long after her father's gentle snores filled their small house. She tried to examine her feelings honestly. Was there truth to her father's implied concern? Had her professional interest in Quentin Xavier evolved into something more personal? She recalled their conversation just 2 days prior, when he had mentioned a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. He had pressed it into her hands, Tennyson's In Memoriam, with a gruff comment about finding solace in its pages after his own losses. It had been the most personal revelation he'd offered, a glimpse behind the armor she'd accused him of wearing. And wasn't that the heart of it? Each small confidence exchanged, each shared observation or quiet moment of understanding had been building something between them, a connection she hadn't anticipated, but couldn't deny. With sudden clarity, Lorelai realized her father was right to be concerned. Not because Quentin had behaved improperly, he had been unfailingly respectful, but because she could no longer pretend her interest in him was purely professional. The question now was what to do about it. Friday evening found Lorelai unusually distracted during her lesson. The men noticed her preoccupation, exchanging glances when she had to ask Isaiah to repeat a question she hadn't properly heard. When the lesson concluded, she packed her materials with methodical slowness, rehearsing what she would say to Quentin. As if summoned by her thoughts, he appeared in the doorway just as the last of the men departed. Tonight, The cooling September air warranted a jacket, which he wore unbuttoned over his usual shirt and vest. "You seem troubled," he observed immediately, proving again his knack for reading people. Lorelai looked up from her slate, momentarily caught off guard by his perceptiveness. "I've been thinking about the future of these lessons," she admitted. "My father has suggested it might be more appropriate if we continued them at the schoolhouse in town." Something flickered across Quentin's face, disappointment, perhaps before his expression settled into neutral acceptance. "I see, because of gossip, in part," she acknowledged, gathering courage to continue. "But also because I'm finding it increasingly difficult to maintain a strictly professional relationship with you, Mr. Xavier." The formal address was deliberate, a step back to safer ground. He noticed, of course, a slight frown appearing between his brows. "Have I done something to make you uncomfortable, Lorelai?" The gentle use of her name unraveled her resolve. "No, quite the opposite, in fact, and therein lies the problem," understanding dawned in his eyes. For a long moment he stood motionless, his gaze never leaving hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, cautious. "I've tried very hard to respect the boundaries of our arrangement," he said. "If I've failed in that, you haven't," she interrupted. "But I find myself looking forward to our conversations more than is proper for a business association." Quentin took a step toward her, then seemed to think better of it, remaining a respectable distance away. "And if I told you I feel the same?" The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing at once. Lorelai's heart quickened, but practicality ingrained by years of responsibility reasserted itself. "Then we would still face the reality that I have a reputation to maintain as the town's teacher, and you have a ranch to run," she replied, trying to inject rationality into a situation that felt increasingly governed by emotion. "Not to mention my obligations to my father." Quentin nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "All valid concerns. So you propose moving the lessons to town?" "Yes. It would allow your men to continue their education while removing any appearance of impropriety." He considered this, then offered an alternative. "What if I accompanied the men to town for their lessons? It would give me a legitimate reason to see you 3 times a week, in a public setting above reproach." The suggestion caught her by surprise, not just for its practicality, but for what it revealed about his intentions. If he was willing to spend 6 hours a week traveling to and from town just to see her, then perhaps his interest matched her own. "That seems a considerable inconvenience for you," she said, testing his resolve. "I consider it worth the trouble," he replied simply. Their gazes held, and in that moment, Lorelai felt the shift between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building steadily over weeks of conversation and quiet observation. "Then perhaps," she ventured, "we might also consider other appropriate ways to further our acquaintance. The Harvest Festival is next weekend." A genuine smile transformed his features. "Are you inviting me to escort you, Miss Elkins?" "I believe I am, Mr. Xavier," she replied, a matching smile playing at her lips despite her attempt at formality. "Then I accept with pleasure." He finally closed the distance between them, taking her hand in his. The touch was chaste, merely his calloused fingers wrapped around hers, yet Lorelai felt it like a current of electricity. "And now, I believe I should see you safely to your horse before we give the good people of Manasseh even more to speculate about." As they walked together into the crisp autumn evening, Lorelai felt a curious lightness in her step. The problem wasn't solved entirely. There would still be talk, still be her father's concerns to address, but they had acknowledged what was growing between them and agreed to explore it properly, with respect for the conventions that governed their small community. It was a beginning, carefully navigated, and for now, that was enough. The Harvest Festival transformed Manasseh's modest town square into a bustling celebration of autumn bounty. Hay bales created seating around a central area cleared for dancing, while tables laden with pies, preserves, and harvest vegetables lined one side. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, casting a warm glow as dusk settled over the festivities. Lorelai had spent the morning helping her students decorate the schoolhouse, which now displayed colorful paper leaves and drawings of pumpkins and cornucopias. She'd rushed home afterward to help her father to town his first significant outing since his illness, before returning home to change into her best dress, a deep blue wool with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. As she pinned her hair, her father watched from the doorway of her small bedroom. "You look like your mother," he said softly. "She wore blue to the harvest dance where I first courted her." Lorelai smiled at him in the mirror. "You never told me that. Some memories are bittersweet to share." He stepped into the room, moving with the caution of a man still regaining his strength. "I've been thinking about what you told me about Xavier's offer to continue the lessons in town. And," she prompted, securing the last pin, "it seems a reasonable compromise." Thomas sat on the edge of her bed. "I spoke with Reverend Caldwell yesterday. He says Xavier has been attending Sunday services these past few weeks, though he slips out before the social hour." Lorelai had noticed Quentin's presence as well, sitting alone in the last pew. She'd pretended not to, just as she'd pretended not to feel his gaze on her when she led the children's choir. "He's a private man," she said, turning to face her father, "but not, I think, a dishonorable one." Thomas studied her for a long moment. "You've grown fond of him." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes, though I've been careful to maintain proprieties." "I know you have." He sighed, patting the bed beside him. When she sat, he took her hand between both of his. "Your mother and I had a love match, Lorelai. Not common in our day, but we were blessed. I've always hoped you would find the same." "Father, let me finish. I worry because you're all I have, and because a man like Xavier carries history in his eyes that speaks of hardship. But if he treats you with respect and kindness, if he makes you smile the way you have been these past weeks, well, perhaps he deserves a fair chance to prove himself." Tears pricked at Lorelai's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning to kiss her father's weathered cheek. A knock at the door announced Quentin's arrival. Lorelai's heart quickened as her father rose to answer it. This would be the first meeting between the two men in her life, and she found herself unaccountably nervous. She heard their voices in the front room, her father's familiar tone and Quentin's deeper one, and took a moment to compose herself before joining them. When she entered, she found them in what appeared to be cordial if somewhat stiff conversation about cattle prices. Quentin turned at her appearance, and the appreciation in his eyes sent warmth flooding through her. He was dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, in a well-cut dark suit with a crisp white shirt and neatly knotted tie. "Miss Elkins," he greeted, the formality for her father's benefit. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Xavier, you're quite handsome yourself." Thomas cleared his throat. "Well, I believe Mrs. Abernathy promised to save a seat for me at her table. You two young people should get along to the festival." He fixed Quentin with a pointed look. "I trust my daughter will be home by a reasonable hour." "Of course, sir. You have my word." The short walk to town was filled with a pleasant tension, their arms occasionally brushing as they navigated the darkening path. When they reached the edge of the festivities, Quentin offered his arm properly, and Lorelai placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, aware of the curious glances their arrival together generated. "People are staring," she murmured, inclining her head toward a group of women who had stopped mid-conversation to observe them. "Let them," Quentin replied, covering her hand with his briefly. "We've done nothing improper." The evening unfolded in a series of pleasant surprises. Quentin, despite his reputation for reclusiveness, proved himself an engaging festival companion. He purchased apple cider for them both, applauded politely when her students performed a harvest song, and even bid generously on her contribution to the pie auction, winning her apple confection for the princely sum of $3, and prompting good-natured ribbing from the auctioneer about paying for the baker rather than the baking. When the fiddlers struck up a Virginia reel, Lorelai was astonished when Quentin led her toward the dance area. "You dance," she asked as they took their places in the line. A hint of mischief lightened his usually serious expression. Poorly, but with enthusiasm. My mother insisted all her children learn. Children, you have siblings. The dance began before he could answer, separating them temporarily as they followed the patterns with their respective lines. When they came together again, hands touching briefly as they circled each other, he continued as if there had been no interruption. Two sisters, both still in Pennsylvania, married with children of their own now. The revelation of this family connection humanized him further, and Lorelai found herself collecting these pieces of his past like precious stones, each one revealing more of the man behind the reserved exterior. As the evening progressed, they danced twice more, sampled Mrs. Henderson's famous pumpkin bread, and gradually migrated toward the quieter edge of the festivities. They found themselves seated on a hay bale partly sheltered by the overhang of the general store, close enough to still be considered part of the celebration, but with enough privacy for conversation. "I'm surprised," Lorelai admitted as they watched couples swirling to a waltz in the lantern light. "By what?" "By how easily you've adapted to social activity tonight. I had the impression you avoided gatherings like this." Quentin considered this, his profile strong against the backdrop of celebration. "I generally do, but tonight I have better company than my own thoughts." The simple compliment warmed her more than the cider they'd been drinking. "Your men have asked when their lessons will resume in town," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "I told them next Wednesday at the schoolhouse. If that suits you." "It does. Though I must warn you, town children have a habit of lingering after hours." "We may have an audience of curious youngsters," he smiled. "I don't mind, in fact." He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. "I thought we might make an outing of it sometimes. After the lessons, perhaps supper at the hotel dining room. With your father as well, of course," he added hastily. "I'd like the opportunity to know him better." The invitation represented more than a simple meal. It was an acknowledgement of serious intent, a public statement of his interest in courting her properly. "I think we would both enjoy that," she replied softly. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when the music changed to a slower, more romantic tune. Quentin glanced at the dancers, then back to her, a question in his eyes. "One more dance," he asked, offering his hand. The waltz brought them closer than the previous dances had allowed, his hand respectfully positioned at her waist, hers on his shoulder. They moved together with surprising harmony for two people still learning each other's rhythms. "You mentioned your sisters are married with children," Lorelai said as they turned in a graceful circle. "Have you never thought of family for yourself?" Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of old pain. "Once, a long time ago." She waited, sensing there was more to the story but unwilling to press if he chose not to share it. After several moments, he continued, his voice lower. "Her name was Rebecca. We were to marry after the war." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She died of typhoid fever while I was fighting at Cold Harbor. I received the letter 3 weeks later." "I'm sorry," Lorelai murmured, understanding now the source of the sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. "It was 12 years ago," he said simply. "For a long time afterward, I couldn't imagine feeling that way again for someone else." The implication that this had changed hung unspoken between them as the music faded. They remained standing close together for a moment after the dance ended, until propriety reasserted itself and they stepped apart. As promised, Quentin escorted her home at her respectable hour, lingering at the door only long enough to thank her for the evening. "I'd like to call on you properly," he said, his tone making it clear this was a formal request to court her. "With your father's permission, of course." Lorelai nodded, suddenly shy despite the warmth spreading through her chest. "I'd like that too." He reached for her hand, raising it slowly to his lips for a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless sent her pulse racing. "Good night, Lorelai." "Good night, Quentin," she replied, watching as he walked back toward town where he'd left his horse. Inside, she found her father dozing in his chair by the fire. He stirred as she closed the door, blinking awake. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he asked, voice rough with sleep. Lorelai hung her shawl on its peg, unable to keep a smile from her face. "Yes, very much." Thomas studied her expression knowingly. "I see, and will Mr. Xavier be calling again?" "He's asked permission to court me properly," she admitted, moving to stoke the dying fire. "If you approve." Her father was silent long enough that she turned to look at him, concerned. His expression was thoughtful rather than disapproving. "He seems a decent man," Thomas said finally. "Not one for idle words or empty gestures. I respect that." He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as his still healing lungs protested. "If he treats you with honor and makes you happy, he has my blessing to call." Lorelai crossed the room to embrace her father, inhaling the familiar scent of pipe tobacco and wool that had meant safety throughout her life. "Thank you, Father." As she prepared for bed that night, Lorelai realized how dramatically her life had changed in the span of a month, from the desperate young woman, prepared to sacrifice her hair for medicine, to a woman being courted by one of the most substantial men in the county. None of it would have happened if Quentin hadn't walked into that barbershop at precisely the right moment. Coincidence or providence, she couldn't say. But as she drifted towards sleep, she found herself grateful for whatever force had brought him into her life. The weeks that followed established a new pattern in Lorelai's life. 3 times weekly, she taught the Xavier Ranch hands in the schoolhouse, with Quentin often observing from the back of the room. On Sundays, he attended church and afterward joined her and her father for dinner, gradually becoming a familiar presence in their modest home. By mid-October, the whole town had adjusted to seeing them together, the initial gossip fading to acceptance that the schoolteacher and the rancher were officially courting. Even Mrs. Abernathy, the most prolific source of local gossip, had moved on to more interesting subjects, namely, whether the new doctor from Denver would choose to settle permanently in Manassas. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, Lorelai was grading arithmetic papers at her desk when a knock at the schoolhouse door interrupted her concentration. She looked up to find Quentin standing in the doorway, a wicker basket in one hand. "I thought you might be hungry," he said by way of greeting. "You mentioned you'd be working through lunch to finish those assessments." The thoughtful gesture touched her. "That's very kind. I am rather famished, actually." He crossed to her desk, setting down the basket and unpacking its contents: bread, cheese, apples, and 2 jars of what appeared to be lemonade. "Mrs. Gunderson at the hotel packed it. I can't take credit for the preparation." "Just for the consideration," she replied with a smile, setting aside her marking pencil. "Will you join me?" They shared the impromptu picnic at her desk, talking easily about his ranch business and her students' progress. Over the past weeks, these conversations had become one of Lorelai's greatest pleasures. Quentin's mind was sharp and well-informed, his observations thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask," he said as they finished the meal. "How is your father's health progressing?" "He seemed stronger at dinner last Sunday. Much improved, thank goodness. Dr. Mills says his lungs may never fully recover from the pneumonia, but with care, he should have many good years ahead." She began repacking the basket, adding, "He's even talking about planting the north field come spring." Quentin looked troubled at this. "Alone, that's a significant undertaking for a man his age, especially after such an illness." "I'll help, of course," Lorelai replied, though privately she shared his concern. The 15-acre farm had been too much for the two of them to manage even before her father's illness. "And perhaps we can hire some help if the teaching income remains steady, or perhaps there's another solution." Quentin's tone turned more serious. "Lorelai, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." The formality in his voice made her pause. "What is it?" "I care for you," he said directly, meeting her gaze across the desk. "These past weeks have confirmed what I suspected from our earliest conversations, that you are a woman of intelligence, compassion, and strength. The kind of woman I had given up hoping to find." Lorelai's heart quickened at his words, but something in his expression kept her from responding immediately. "I believe you have similar feelings," he continued, "but I also know your dedication to your father and your teaching. So before I speak further on personal matters, I wanted to propose a business arrangement that might solve some of your practical concerns." "A business arrangement," she echoed, confused by this unexpected turn. "Yes, your father's farm adjoins my east pasture. The soil there is good, better than much of my grazing land, but underutilized because of your limited resources. I'd like to propose a partnership, my men and equipment to work the land, a fair division of the harvest, and wages for your father as a consultant on crop management." Lorelai blinked, trying to process the offer. "You want to farm our land? I want to help your family secure its future," he corrected gently, "without requiring your father to risk his health or you to work beyond your strength. The arrangement would benefit us both: diversification for my ranch, security for your family." It was a generous offer, one that addressed her most pressing practical concerns, yet something about it troubled her. "And the personal matters you mentioned?" she asked cautiously. Quentin reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. "Those are entirely separate, Lorelai. Whether you accept this proposal or not, my feelings for you remain unchanged. I simply didn't want you to think I was using business to influence personal decisions." The distinction was important, a respect for her autonomy that she valued. Still, the entanglement of their lives that such an arrangement would create couldn't be ignored. "I need to discuss this with my father," she said finally. "It's a significant decision." "Of course." He released her hand and stood. "Take whatever time you need. The offer stands regardless of your answer." As she watched him gather the picnic basket, Lorelai was struck by the care he took in everything from bringing her lunch to structuring a proposal that protected her independence while addressing practical needs. It spoke volumes about his character and, she realized, about the depth of his feelings for her. That evening, she presented Quentin's proposal to her father. Thomas listened thoughtfully, asking pointed questions about terms and conditions that revealed his farmer's practicality despite his poetic nature. "It's a fair offer," he acknowledged when she finished. "More than fair, in fact. But I wonder if there isn't more behind it than simple business sense." Lorelai felt heat rise to her cheeks. He was very clear that the arrangement stands regardless of personal developments between us. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And are there personal developments to consider?" "I care for him, father, deeply." Her father nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. He looks at you the way I used to look at your mother." He reached for his pipe, a sign he was settling in for serious contemplation. "Tell me honestly, daughter, if you were free of obligations to me and this farm, would your feelings for Xavier be any different?" The question caught her off guard. "No," she replied without hesitation. "My feelings for him have nothing to do with practical considerations." "Then perhaps we should accept his offer," Thomas said, surprising her. "Not because it benefits us, though it surely does, but because it speaks well of his character that he thought to propose it in such a way. He's trying to remove barriers without presuming upon your affections." Lorelai hadn't considered it from that perspective, but her father's insight rang true. "So you're not opposed to the business arrangement? No, to whatever may be developing between you two?" Thomas tamped tobacco into his pipe with a thoughtful expression. "I've watched him these past weeks, Lorelai. He treats you with respect. He listens when you speak. He remembers the things you care about." He struck a match, puffing until the tobacco caught. "Those are the actions of a man who values a woman for herself, not just for what she brings him. Your mother would approve, and so do I." The simple benediction meant more to Lorelai than elaborate praise from anyone else could have. "Thank you, Father." 2 days later, after church services, Lorelai informed Quentin of their decision to accept his business proposal. They were walking back toward her house for Sunday dinner, a few paces behind her father, who conversed with Reverend Caldwell. "I'm glad," Quentin said, relief evident in his voice. I'll have my lawyer draw up the formal agreement this week. I appreciate your thoughtfulness, she replied. The arrangement will ease many of my concerns about Father's health and our future security. Quentin glanced ahead to ensure they weren't overheard before saying quietly, "There's something else I'd like to discuss with you, Lorelai. Not today. I think one significant conversation is enough. But perhaps you might accompany me for a drive tomorrow afternoon." The seriousness of his tone made her heart quicken. Of course. The following day dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the drive Quentin had proposed. He arrived at precisely 3 o'clock as promised, driving a handsome buggy pulled by a matched pair of bays. Lorelai had taken special care with her appearance, wearing a russet-colored dress that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the green of her eyes. They drove beyond the outskirts of town, following the road that wound alongside Crystal Creek before turning onto a less traveled path that climbed gradually into the foothills. The aspens had turned golden, creating a spectacular display against the evergreens and blue sky. "It's beautiful," Lorelai breathed as they crested a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. "I thought you might appreciate it," Quentin replied, drawing the horses to a halt at a natural overlook. "I come here sometimes when I need to think." He secured the reins and helped her down from the buggy, leading her to a flat boulder that served as a natural bench overlooking the panorama. They sat side by side, the October sun warm despite the altitude. "What did you want to discuss?" Lorelai asked when the silence had stretched comfortably for several minutes. Quentin turned slightly to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Us, our future." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. "I'm listening." "I've been careful these past weeks not to rush things between us," he began. "After Rebecca, I never expected to find someone who could make me feel this way again. When I walked into that barbershop and saw you about to sacrifice something precious for your father's sake, it woke something in me I thought was long dead." The raw honesty in his voice touched her deeply. "Quentin," he held up a hand gently, "please let me finish. I've rehearsed this too many times to lose my courage now." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Lorelai. I think I began falling in love with you that very first day, and every conversation since has only deepened those feelings. You've brought light back into a life that had grown too solitary, too focused on work rather than living." Tears pricked at Lorelai's eyes as he reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. "I don't want to rush you," he continued. "I know we've known each other only a short time, but I also know my own heart and it belongs to you now." He met her gaze directly. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer, but I want you to know my intentions are serious. When you're ready, if you feel as I do, I want to make a life with you." The declaration, though not a formal proposal, left no doubt of his ultimate aim. Lorelai found herself momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling in his words and the answering emotion in her own heart. "I love you too," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to be cautious, to guard my heart until I was certain. But I think I've known for weeks now." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her knuckles. "You've made me happier than I thought possible." "But," she continued, needing to voice her one remaining concern, "my father will always have a home with us," Quentin assured her immediately. "I would never ask you to choose between your family and me. Whatever future we build will include him." Relief and gratitude washed over her at his understanding. "Thank you. That means everything to me." For a long moment, they sat together in the golden afternoon light, hands entwined, the vast landscape spread before them like a promise of possibilities. Then, with gentle deliberation, Quentin raised his hand to her cheek, his touch whisper light. "May I?" he murmured, his intention clear. Lorelai nodded, her heart racing as he leaned forward to press his lips to hers in a kiss that began tenderly but deepened as she responded. His arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer, while her hand found its way to his shoulder. steadying herself against the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the Harvest Festival," he admitted. "I'm glad you waited until now," she replied. "It made it all the more special." The drive back to town was filled with a new awareness of each other, their conversation flowing between practical plans for the farm partnership and more personal dreams for the future. By the time Quentin helped her down from the buggy at her door, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold that seemed to mirror the joy in Lorelai's heart. "I'll call tomorrow with the partnership papers," he said, reluctant to leave her. "And perhaps we could discuss when to speak formally with your father about other matters," Lorelai smiled, squeezing his hand. "He already knows, I think, but yes, we should talk to him together." As she watched him drive away, Lorelai marveled at how completely her life had transformed in the span of 2 months. From desperation to hope, from solitude to love all, because a man with kind eyes had walked into a barber shop and offered his hand when she needed it most. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The partnership agreement was signed, and Quentin's men began preparing the Elkins fields for spring planting. Thomas, buoyed by the security the arrangement provided and his daughter's evident happiness, seemed to gain strength daily, offering his expertise on crop selection and rotation with renewed enthusiasm. In early November, after a formal dinner at Quentin's ranch where he officially asked Thomas for Lorelai's hand, they announced their engagement to the town. The news was met with general approval, even Mrs. Abernathy admitted that they made a handsome couple, though she couldn't resist commenting that the schoolmarm certainly landed on her feet after that scare with her father's illness. Wedding plans occupied much of Lorelai's free time. They had agreed on a December ceremony not so soon as to appear hasty, but soon enough to allow them to begin the new year as husband and wife. The schoolhouse would close for winter break, giving Lorelai time to move her belongings to the ranch and settle into her new role as Mrs. Xavier before classes resumed in January. "Will you continue teaching after we're married?" Quentin had asked one evening as they discussed their future. They were seated in her father's parlor, Thomas having tactfully excused himself to his bedroom to give them privacy. "I'd like to if you don't object," she replied, "at least until we start a family." The mention of children brought a tender expression to his face. "I'd never ask you to give up something that brings you such joy. We can arrange for transportation to and from town, whatever you need." Such considerations, small but significant, continually reinforced Lorelai's certainty that she had found a true partner. Quentin respected her independence and intelligence while offering the security and companionship she had long desired but never expected to find. As their wedding day approached, practical matters demanded attention. Lorelai and Thomas would move to the ranch, where Quentin had already begun expanding the main house to include a comfortable suite for her father, with its own entrance ensuring both privacy and inclusion in their daily lives. 2 weeks before the wedding, as Lorelai was helping her students decorate the schoolhouse for Christmas, she received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Mills, who had treated her father's pneumonia, appeared in the doorway looking grave. "Miss Elkins, might I have a word?" he asked, gesturing toward the hallway. Concern immediately tightened her chest. "Of course." She instructed her students to continue their work and followed the doctor outside. "Is it father? Has he had a relapse?" No, nothing like that," Dr. Mills assured her. "Mr. Elkins is doing remarkably well, all things considered. It's about your fiancé, Mr. Xavier." "Quentin," alarm replaced concern. "Has something happened?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "Not exactly, it's just, I received a letter from a colleague in Denver. There was an outbreak of influenza at the Maxwell Hotel last week, and Mr. Xavier's name appeared on the guest register during that period." Lorelai frowned in confusion. "That's impossible. Quentin was here all last week. We had dinner together on Tuesday and Thursday evenings." Relief visibly washed over the doctor's face. Thank goodness. I was concerned he might have been exposed and could be carrying the illness without symptoms yet. He shook his head. Must be another Xavier then. Uncommon name, so I thought I should check. Thank you for your concern, Lorelai said, though a small seed of uneasiness had been planted in her mind. Quentin had never mentioned business in Denver, nor any plans to travel. That evening, when he called at her home as had become their custom, she casually mentioned the doctor's visit. Doctor. Mills had the strangest concern today, she said as they sat by the fire, her father dozing in his chair across the room. He'd heard from a colleague in Denver about an influenza outbreak at a hotel where someone named Xavier had registered. If she hadn't been watching closely, she might have missed the slight stiffening of his shoulders. Is that so? Yes, silly of course, since you were here all last week. She kept her tone light, giving him the opportunity to explain. Quentin was silent for a long moment, his expression troubled. Finally, he sighed. I had hoped to wait until after the wedding to discuss this, but perhaps it's better to clear the air now. He glanced toward Thomas, ensuring he was still asleep before continuing quietly. It wasn't me in Denver, Lorelai, it was my brother. Your brother, she echoed, genuinely surprised. You've never mentioned having a brother, Quentin Xavier, my twin. The admission seemed difficult for him. We haven't spoken in nearly 10 years. The revelation stunned her. A twin brother never once mentioned in all their conversations about family. Why? Quentin stared into the fire, his profile rigid with tension. The war changed us both, but in different ways. I came west seeking peace. Quinn, he sought other things, made choices I couldn't condone. What sort of choices? She pressed gently. He rode with Quantrill for a time after the war, Quentin said flatly, raided along the Kansas border. Later, he drifted further west, working as a hired gun. The implications were clear. Quentin Xavier had chosen a life on the wrong side of the law, perhaps even as a notorious gunfighter. The contrast with Quentin's upright character could hardly be more stark. You cut ties with him because of this? She asked, trying to understand. I tried to help him for years, Quentin replied, a deep sadness evident in his voice. Offered him work, a fresh start, but Quinn, he has a darkness in him. The last time we spoke, he had been implicated in a stagecoach robbery near Pueblo. He came to me for money to flee to Mexico. I refused. His hands clenched briefly. He threatened to ruin my reputation, to tell people we were one and the same person, that I had participated in his crimes. I told him if he ever came near me or my ranch again, I'd turn him in myself. Lorelai reached for his hand, understanding now his reluctance to speak of this painful history. I'm sorry, that must have been devastating to lose your brother that way. It was like losing part of myself, he admitted quietly, but I couldn't continue enabling him. I built my life here on honest work, Lorelai. I couldn't let him destroy that. Of course not, she assured him. But why keep his existence a secret? Surely people would understand you're not responsible for your brother's actions. Quentin finally looked at her, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. Because I was ashamed and afraid. In small communities like this, rumors spread, associations matter. I didn't want to be known as the rancher with the outlaw brother. He squeezed her hand. And later, when I met you, I was afraid it might change how you saw me. The honesty of his confession touched her deeply. Nothing could change how I see you, Quentin. You are not your brother. You're the man I love, the man who offered help when I needed it most, who treats my father with respect, who values education enough to arrange it for his men. Relief washed over his features. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry for keeping this from you. We all have parts of our past that are difficult to share, she replied, thinking of her own mother's slow decline and death, a subject she rarely discussed. But we're building a future together. That means no more secrets between us. He nodded solemnly. No more secrets, I promise. The conversation strengthened rather than weakened their bond. In sharing this painful aspect of his past, Quentin had revealed a vulnerability that made Lorelai love him even more deeply. She understood now some of the shadows that occasionally darkened his eyes, the burden of a brother lost not to death, but to choices that had placed him beyond reach. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sky a brilliant blue above Manasseh. The small church was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, simple but festive for both the Christmas season and the celebration of marriage. Lorelai stood in the church vestry, her father beside her, waiting for the music that would signal their entrance. Her wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, had been a gift from Quentin, ordered from a dressmaker in Denver. "Nervous?" Thomas asked, patting her hand where it rested on his arm. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly just happy." Her father smiled, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become, Lorelai, and she would approve of your choice in husband." "Thank you, father." She leaned to kiss his cheek, careful not to disturb the veil that draped over her carefully arranged hair, the same hair Quentin had saved from the barber's shears, now adorned with tiny white flowers. The organ music swelled, their cue to proceed. Thomas straightened, offering his arm with formal dignity. "Shall we, daughter?" The church was filled with familiar faces, her students and their families, townspeople who had known her since childhood, Quentin's ranch hands sitting somewhat awkwardly in their Sunday best. But Lorelai saw only Quentin, standing tall and handsome at the altar, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of such profound love and wonder that she felt her heart might burst. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion, the traditional vows spoken in clear, steady voices, the exchange of rings, his a simple gold band, hers a delicate circle with 3 small diamonds, and finally, the minister's pronouncement that they were husband and wife. Quentin's kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet conveying a promise of deeper intimacy to come. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Xavier, Lorelai felt a sense of rightness that confirmed every decision that had led to this moment. The celebration afterward was held at the hotel dining room, transformed by evergreen garlands and candles into a festive venue. There was music and dancing, a feast prepared by Mrs. Gunderson and her staff, and countless well wishes from the townspeople who had come to accept Quentin as one of their own through his association with their beloved teacher. Late in the afternoon, as the winter sun began its early descent, the newlyweds prepared to depart for the ranch, now their shared home. Thomas would follow the next day, giving them one night of privacy before family life began in earnest. As Quentin handed Lorelai into the buggy, now decorated with ribbons and bells by his mischievous ranch hands, she caught sight of a stranger standing at the edge of the square, observing the festivities. For a moment, the man's resemblance to her husband was so striking that she gasped softly. "What is it?" Quentin asked, following her gaze. The man had already turned away, disappearing down a side street. "Nothing," she replied, uncertain whether she had actually seen Quentin Xavier or if her imagination, fueled by Quentin's revelations, had conjured a ghost. "Just the cold." Quentin tucked a warm blanket around her legs. "We'll be home soon," he promised, his use of the word home, now their shared domain, sending a pleasant thrill through her despite her momentary unease. As they drove through the gathering dusk toward the ranch, snow began to fall in lazy, drifting flakes that caught in Lorelai's hair and on Quentin's shoulders. It seemed a benediction, nature's blessing on their union, and by the time they reached the house, the world had been transformed into a glistening wonderland of white. Quentin lifted her from the buggy and, to her surprise and delight, swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home. Inside, the house had been prepared for their arrival, a fire burning in the hearth, a bottle of champagne chilling on the table, and fresh flowers in the bedroom despite the winter season. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," Quentin murmured, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "Home," Lorelai repeated, leaning into his embrace. "I like the sound of that." Later that night, as they lay tangled together in the soft darkness of their bedroom, Lorelai marveled at how completely her life had changed in the span of 3 months. From a desperate young woman willing to sell her hair to save her father, to the beloved wife of a man whose generosity had opened a door to happiness she had never imagined possible. "What are you thinking?" Quentin asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm grateful you happened to walk into that barber shop," she replied, resting her hand over his heart. "Though I'm beginning to suspect it wasn't entirely coincidence." He smiled in the darkness. "I'd seen you before teaching your students in the schoolyard, shopping at the Mercantile. I admired you from afar but hadn't found the courage to introduce myself. The fearless rancher, afraid to speak to the schoolteacher?" she teased gently. "Terrified," he admitted with a chuckle. "But when Peterson mentioned in passing that you might be selling your beautiful hair for money, I couldn't bear the thought. It gave me the excuse I needed to finally approach you." Lorelai propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, touched by this confession. "So you orchestrated our meeting. Let's say I recognized an opportunity and found my courage." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I never imagined then how completely you would change my life. For the better, I hope." His answer was a kiss that conveyed more than words ever could, a promise of devotion, of partnership, of a lifetime of love that had begun with a single act of kindness in a small town barber shop. Spring came early to Manassas in 1884, bringing with it new beginnings for the Xavier household. The expanded ranch house comfortably accommodated Thomas, who had taken to his role as agricultural advisor with enthusiasm, his health continuing to improve in the clear mountain air. Lorelai had resumed teaching at the schoolhouse, riding to town each morning on a beautiful mare Quentin had given her as a wedding present, often accompanied by her husband when his ranch duties permitted. The partnership between the Xavier Ranch and the Elkins farm had proven beneficial beyond expectations. The first crops were already showing promising signs in the newly plowed fields, and the addition of agriculture to the ranch operations had increased its value substantially. On a warm May afternoon, Lorelai returned from school earlier than usual, having dismissed her students to enjoy the perfect weather after completing their examinations. She found Quentin and her father seated on the porch, engaged in animated discussion about irrigation techniques for the summer months. "You're home early," Quentin observed with pleasure, rising to greet her with a kiss. 5 months of marriage had done nothing to diminish their affection for each other. If anything, their bond had deepened as they settled into the rhythms of shared life. "The children were too restless to keep indoors," she explained, joining them on the porch. "And I have some news I wanted to share." Something in her tone must have alerted both men, for they regarded her with sudden attention. "What is it, daughter?" Thomas asked, setting aside the agricultural journal he'd been consulting. Lorelai took a seat beside Quentin, reaching for his hand. "I visited Dr. Mills on my way home," she said, unable to keep a smile from spreading across her face. "He confirms what I've suspected for a few weeks now. We're going to have a baby sometime in late November." The joy that illuminated Quentin's face was answer enough to any uncertainty she might have harbored about his reaction. He gathered her into his arms, holding her with tender care as if she had suddenly become fragile. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." Thomas was equally delighted, his eyes suspiciously bright as he embraced his daughter. "Nothing makes a man feel more immortal than the promise of grandchildren," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The months that followed were filled with preparations. Quentin converted one of the unused bedrooms into a nursery, commissioning a local craftsman to build a cradle from cherry wood. Lorelai sewed tiny garments in the evenings, her happiness evident in the songs she hummed as she worked. By mutual agreement, she continued teaching through October, arranging for a substitute to finish the term while she prepared for the baby's arrival. The women of Manassas, led by Mrs. Abernathy, organized a gathering to celebrate the impending birth. bringing gifts and advice in equal measure. Throughout this time, there was no further sign of Quentin Xavier. Whatever Lorelai had glimpsed on their wedding day, if indeed it had been Quentin's estranged twin, had not manifested in any disturbance to their happiness. Occasionally, she would catch Quentin scanning the horizon with a watchful expression, but he never spoke of concern, and she chose not to reawaken painful memories by asking. On a snowy evening in late November, as Thanksgiving approached, Lorelai felt the first pains that signaled their child's imminent arrival. Quentin sent for Dr. Mills, who arrived just as the contractions intensified. Thomas took up a vigil in the parlor while Quentin refused to leave his wife's side despite the doctor's initial protests. "I've delivered calves and foals," he said firmly. "I'm staying with my wife." The labor was long but uncomplicated. Just after midnight, as the first flakes of a new snowfall began to drift past the window, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that spoke of healthy lungs and a strong constitution. "He's perfect," Quentin whispered, cradling the swaddled infant with hands that trembled slightly. "Lorelai, he's absolutely perfect." Through exhausted tears of joy, Lorelai watched her husband with their child. This man who had once believed love was forever lost to him, now transformed by the miracle of new life. They had agreed on names earlier: William Thomas Xavier if it was a boy, after both their fathers, or Rebecca Ann if it was a girl, honoring both Quentin's lost love and Lorelai's mother. "William," she murmured, reaching to touch the downy head. "Welcome to the world, little one." Later, after Dr. Mills had departed and Thomas had been introduced to his grandson, Quentin sat beside Lorelai on their bed, the baby sleeping peacefully between them. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed, his voice low with emotion. "After Rebecca died, I believed that part of my life was over. I built the ranch focused on work, convinced myself it was enough." He touched their son's tiny hand with gentle wonder. "But you changed everything, Lorelai. From the moment I saw you in that barbershop, ready to sacrifice something precious out of love for your father, you awakened my heart." Lorelai reached across their sleeping child to touch her husband's face. "And you saved more than my hair that day, Quentin. You offered hope when I had none. You saw value in me beyond what I could sell." "Your hair was just the outward symbol of your beauty," he replied, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "It was your courage, your determination I admired from the start." As William stirred between them, making the tiny sounds of a newborn adjusting to the world, Lorelai reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter, an act of kindness, a gradual building of trust and affection that had blossomed into deep, abiding love. "I'd give up my hair 1,000 times over for this life with you," she whispered. Quentin smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that still made her heart skip a beat. "Fortunately, you'll never have to make that choice again. Everything I have is yours, my love, just as my heart has been from the beginning." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white, a clean slate, a fresh beginning, a promise of seasons to come for the family that had begun with a simple declaration: "Take my money instead of your beauty." In the years that followed, the Xavier Ranch flourished, as did the family that called it home. William was joined by a sister, Anne, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, James, completing their family. Lorelai resumed teaching part-time as the children grew, eventually realizing her dream of establishing Manassas's first proper library in a small building Quentin donated to the town. Thomas Elkins lived to see all 3 of his grandchildren reach adulthood, his health sustained by mountain air, purposeful work, and the joy of family life. When he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, he was mourned as a beloved patriarch whose wisdom had helped transform the Xavier Ranch into one of the most prosperous and progressive in Colorado. As for Quentin Xavier, he appeared only once more in their lives on William's 5th birthday, when a package arrived containing a hand-carved wooden horse and a note that read simply, For my nephew. May he grow to be like his father." There was no return address, no further contact, but the gesture spoke of a man perhaps seeking his own redemption in small ways. Through seasons of plenty and times of hardship, drought years, economic downturns, the inevitable challenges of family life, Quentin and Lorelai's partnership remained unshakable. They faced each trial together, their love deepening with shared experience and mutual respect. On cool autumn evenings, they could often be found on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Sometimes, Quentin would reach out to touch his wife's hair, still auburn though now threaded with silver, and smile at the memory of their first meeting. "Best investment I ever made," he would say, and Lorelai would lean into his embrace, grateful for the chance encounter that had changed everything. In a small town in Colorado, their story became something of a legend, how the schoolteacher had been prepared to sell her beautiful hair to save her ailing father, and how the rancher had offered not just money, but a future filled with love. It was a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments can open doors to happiness beyond imagining, if only we have the courage to step through them.